Hey everybody, so anyone new to quilting really needs to get familiar with a couple of basic tools that's really going to help make your quilting journey so much faster and easier. And I've got them right in front of me here. It's a cutting mat, a ruler, and a rotary cutter. Lots of people have asked me, what's a rotary cutter? What's a self-healing mat? And what kind of ruler do you mean? So these are very specific tools used to cut fabric. When you're quilting, you do not use scissors for cutting fabric. In fact, I bet you make a whole quilt and never use a pair of scissors. You might use little snips like this for thread and for, the little stringy bits. But for the most part, every time you're cutting fabric when you're quilting, you are using the rotary cutter. So if you've never done this before, it does take a little bit of practice, but you can totally do it. But before we get to cutting, I want to introduce you to these things with a little more depth. This is my cutting mat. This is a self-healing mat, which means when I take something really sharp and cut on it, it's not going to scratch, it's not going to damage it. So when I put my fabric down on here and I cut, nothing happens. It's amazing. Now I'm going to use my ruler to help me guide my rotary cutter. And you'll notice the size is actually quite important here. My ruler is the same size, length, as my mat. Now, you will end up, as you go along quilting, probably, developing a little bit of a ruler collection. Maybe you'll end up with some smaller squares or a skinnier one. But if you're just starting out, I'd recommend getting the largest cutting mat you can. Oftentimes people will go for 18 by 24 or the 36 by 24. This is a 36 by 24, but I do know online there are sets that come with a ruler and a rotary cutter that you can get, but they are 18 by 24, so not quite as big. The bigger the mat, the better. But of course, the bigger the mat, the more expensive. So you figure out with your budget what you can spring for. But what I would recommend is whatever size you get, please try to make sure that your ruler is as long as your cutting mat. This is going to be important because we're going to want to be able to cut right to the end of the mat. And if our ruler, let's say, only goes halfway and our fabric's up here, then we've got to shift things up and the cutting just becomes a little more cumbersome and a little more complicated. So when you're starting out, if you start out with the tools that will help you get better, you're going to be more successful. So I'm using, like I said, a 24 by 36 inch mat, and I'm using a 24 by 6 inch ruler. Now, you could go for a much larger ruler. This is 24 by 8.5. I don't think you need it to be that big, but of course it will still work. There's smaller rulers like this on the market too. This one is a 6 inch by 12 inch, but again, my fabric is going to be much longer than this. So I'm going to save this for things that are smaller cutting jobs. For the most part, I find myself reaching most often for the 6 by 24 inch ruler. And for my rotary cutter, I'm using a 45 millimeter. You could use larger, you could use smaller, but I find myself reaching most often for this medium sized 45 millimeter. You can find them, at Michael's or at any sewing store. This one's from Olfa, nice and sharp. And you do want to make sure you change out your cutting blades every so often. And you'll know when you need to do it because there'll be little threads left when you do your cut. It won't totally separate. That's where you can tell there's little nicks in your blades. So I'm starting with a fresh blade, so we're ready to get cutting. Always try to start with a freshly pressed, ironed piece of fabric. Because if you've got wrinkles in your fabric, that's going to change the size of things. Because if you've got a little wrinkle, even if it's just a millimeter, it does change things. So make sure your fabric is always nice and flat, freshly pressed. I also like to make sure my fabric is washed. So wash it, dry it, press it, then you're good to go. Now, you'll notice here, my fabric is the complete width of the bolt. This is a 1/4 yard, but you'll see it stretches way beyond my mat. Now, we can't have mats as big as the universe. We're not a sewing shop. We're just cutting at home. So here's how I almost always cut my fabric. On the fold. If you fold it in half and bring it to you, this is why a mat that's 24 inches tall is great, because when you fold a full bolt of fabric in half, your ruler will fit at the top and bottom, and your fabric will fit completely on your mat. The first thing you always want to do when you're cutting is cut off this raggedy edge, because we want to make sure we're cutting a very, very straight seam to start our project. So we've got to clean up the edge or true up the edge. And before we do that, if this is the first time you're ever really touching your ruler, your rotary cutter, and your mat, set your nice fabric aside for a minute and grab a scrap. I'll save my nice stuff for when I'm really feeling confident. And this is what I'm going to practice on. So this is a scrap. It's a complete width of a bolt too. So again, I'm going to fold it in half. And you'll be able to see here, it kind of bows out. It's totally not straight. This is an offcut, totally a scrap. So I'm going to put the side that I want to cut always towards my dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, which means I'm going to hold the rotary cutter in my hand like this with the blade facing my left hand. And this is how you're going to hold it, with your finger sort of gripping like this, not like this, with your finger to add that extra pressure. And I want your ruler to be in your non-dominant hand. So for me, that's the left, my rotary cutter in my dominant hand. And I always want to be cutting off the piece that is either going to be used or discarded. My main bulk of my fabric should always stay, in this case, to the left. Because if I were to make a slip, like cut and go, whoa, and slip accidentally like this, at least all I've wasted here is this ½ inch. If I were to be cutting on this side and make a slip, well, now I've slipped all the way into my good fabric. Not great. Slips will happen. So if you are always cutting into the piece that you're either going to use or throw away, then if you slip, you haven't wasted so much. So the first thing I want you to do is try to line up some kind of edge. There's always some edge of your fabric, even if it's just the selvage, that's fairly straight. And I want you to try to line up that edge with the straight lines on your mat. Now me, I almost always cut on the 1. It does make having to measure a little different, because if you're measuring up to 10, you really need to measure to 11 to get 10. I like using the 1 as my line, because if I use the 0, I tend to cover up the big numbers and cover up the little notches that show me the 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4 mark. So I like doing it on the 1, but you'll develop your own preference. But this is just how I like to do it. Mostly because I'm bad at math. I need to see all the things. So if you line up one edge fairly straight, we will start to develop a straight system. Now I can bring my ruler over, and you'll notice the same grid line is on my ruler that's on the mat. Now if what I'm trying to do is start with a straight edge, I want to bring my ruler over, and I want to waste as little fabric as possible. So in this case, the closest measurement is 7.5. On the ruler, you've got 1/4, 1/2, 3/4 full. So I like to use the lines on the ruler and line those up with the lines or the dots on the mat. So in this case, my measurement is about 7.5 to get a straight edge. So I'm going to take that 1/2 on the ruler and line that right up with the 7, so that the dots, the halfway mark on the mat, is meeting up with the edge of my ruler. And I know I'm straight if my straight line on the ruler is totally covering the line on the mat, and the edge of my ruler is covering the line, or right on the line of the mat, on both the bottom and up here on the top. So that half is a little bit over. I'm going to make sure my half mark on my ruler is getting right on that 7. And so you can see how much fabric has to be taken off up here versus how little gets taken off down here. So this should be a nice straight line. You're going to put your left hand, or your non-dominant hand, for me that's my left hand, right in the center of your ruler. I tend to use my fingertips, but you could use your palm if it's easier, but I tend to use my fingertips. And you really got to put some body weight down here, you guys. You know, you really have to hold it strongly, and you really have to cut with confidence. And you're going to butt your rotary cutter right up against your ruler and do it all in one go. And look at the nice straight line that we're left with. Even if this edge down here isn't totally straight, we now will be able to square that up because we have a perfectly straight edge here. And now I can cut off that selvage edge too, lining my ruler, the edge up with that line, and then making sure my lines, my grid lines, are all even, both horizontally and vertically. That's how you know your ruler is square with the mat. Sometimes when you get to the very end, it's just off a little, and that will make the difference in how square your fabric is. So once you've got the ruler lines matched up with the mat lines, you're ready to put some pressure with your fingertips, hold onto your ruler, butt it up against it, and just follow the ruler as your guide. You don't need to worry about the numbers or anything like that. You're just following the ruler. And now I've got a perfectly square edge. And because I'm cutting on the fold, if my pattern were to call for, let's say, a 5-inch square, I could count over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and lay my ruler down. Make sure my ruler lines are matching up with my mat lines. Confidence. And there we have 5 inches, and now we want to go 5 the other way. So in this case, I'm going to protect my good piece of material underneath my ruler, because if I were to make a mistake, I'd be going into the part I'm going to throw away. So 5, cut with confidence, and now I'm left with a 5 by 5 inch square. Well, 2 actually, because we've cut on the fold. And that's what's great about cutting on the fold. So practice a little bit on some scraps before you get to your nice fabric. And I'm going to show you how to cut your good fabric now. So I'm going to take that selvage and I'm just going to run it along the 1-inch line. And you can see it kind of, cropping over here because it's not totally straight. It never is. I'll bring my ruler over, and on the closest measurement I can to the edge of the fabric, so I'm not wasting too much. In this case, it is just a 1/4 inch off at the bottom and about a 1/2 inch off at the top. So I'm going to line up my 1/4 mark of my ruler right on the 18, and then I know I'm cutting straight. Make sure all the other squares are also even. And at first you might fiddle with this for a few minutes before you make your cut. That's totally normal. But you will develop a little bit of a speed, like, yep, all lined up, all lined up. Pressure, and avoid this. You want to do it all in one swoop. By sort of sawing it, what inevitably ends up happening is you might move your hand, and then you'll end up with a jagged cut and you'll have to square it up again. Now, once you have a squared off edge, which is what this is, you can go ahead and square off the selvage end if you want, or you can just start cutting for whatever your pattern recommends. If your pattern is calling for 2-inch by width of fabric, then you will have a chance again to square this up when you turn your fabric around. So in this case, my pattern is calling for 4 1/4 inch strips by width of fabric, because we're going to cut 4¼ by 4¼ inch squares. And to do that, I literally count and tap the squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then find a quarter with the ruler. So that's just one dot over, or 2 notches over. And make sure you find it at the top too. This is why having your ruler meet the top is really important. It's also going to mean that on your ruler, and I know this is a little confusing, that the 3/4 inch line is going to line up with the next number. And that's sort of where my eye tends to go. I find it easier to line those lines up than I do the little dots on the mat. So now I cut back, or I count back. So there's a quarter, 1, 2, 3, 4. I know we have 4¼ now. This is a good piece. So we have lots of weight on the fabric, and we're going to do it all in one go. Ready? There we go. Now, when you get really efficient, you will not move your fabric because your pattern will tell you how many of these strips to cut. That's called a subcut. So you can either move it back over to the line, or you can count over 4¼ again. So because we're already over a 1/4 inch, I tend to go 175, 275, 375, 475, and then take off what I need to. So I need to get to the halfway mark here. Now, I stopped halfway and I could feel my ruler moving over. Really try to do it all in one motion. But if that happens, like you can see there is a little slight bend. It's barely noticeable. But look at against that straight line where I stopped. You can see it just kind of dip in ever so much. Now, I would not discard this piece. I would still use it. Even when you don't think your ruler has moved, stopping mid-cut will make for a slight imperfection in your cut. So really try to get it all in one motion. Otherwise, you do get left with these sort of little dips. Now, we will make up for that in our seam allowance, but still, if you're cutting multiple layers of fabric, which I'm going to show you next, this could really be a problem. All right, so I'm going to go and cut over 4¼ again. And now to get those squares, I'm just going to line these up all on a straight edge, and we can cut our squares all at one time. We want to cut off that selvage edge. We learned how to do that, so that's at about halfway. We're taking about a 1/2 inch off. And then I can take off all of those salvages at once. Again, one fall swoop right through them all. That's an easy way to get rid of them. And now everything is lined up, and we can start measuring over 4¼ again. So every single time, lining it up at the top, lining it up at the bottom on your mat and your ruler, lots of pressure. And now, because we cut this on the fold, we're getting 2, 4, 6 done at once. This is much more efficient. And once you get a little more confident, I would suggest layering up your fabrics, and we could probably cut 3 or 4 pieces of these at once. And then you're going to have stacks cut at once. But let's finish this one first, and then I'll show you how to layer it. And if you do mess up a cut, just take that piece and add it to your scrap bin and keep going. It happens. If you really want to get efficient about cutting, try layering your fabric. Again, I'm folding it in half, laying it down on the line. It does need to get squared up, but I'm going to take a couple pieces at once and try to lay them as close as I can together. There's definitely a bigger risk for error here, but when you have to cut hundreds of squares, sometimes it's worth it. So if you're feeling confident, like you've done a couple and you could layer them up and make quicker work out of the cutting, then go ahead. Just make sure you're ready. So we've got a lot of squaring off to do here. So I've got 3 layers. I'm going to cut off about 1/2 inch. That way I've really made sure I'm getting all of the salvaged edge all the way on all of the fabrics, lining it up at the top and the bottom. And you really do need to press a little bit harder to go through all these layers. Now they're all nice and even. And again, I can go over my 4 1/4. And now you can either move this out of the way or just keep going. If you're not totally confident on the measurement, move it over to a line that's easier to count from. Get rid of your extras, and then you can turn. Try not to unlayer your fabrics. Keep them all together as best you can, because you want everything to stay the same. And then we're going to square up that edge. Again, I've got my salvage pieces here. I'm just finding a straight line to put my edge on, doesn't matter where. All those little edges come off at once when you're layering it up. And now I can go over 4 1/4, 1, 2, 3, 4 1/4. My line on my ruler is matching the lines on the mat. Lined up, lots of pressure. Now look at how many we're cutting at once. So that's 6, 12, 18 at once. You can see our stack grows so much faster when we layer up our fabrics to cut them. But again, only do this if you're feeling ready, because there's a lot more to lose if you miscut a layered square. You can always try layering up some scraps and see how you do with the extra bulk before you use your nice fabric. So this one I felt like I kind of messed up. I kind of felt myself move. I know I've got a little bit of extra fabric at the end of each row, so I may as well make sure I'm always starting with a fresh, straight edge, even if it means having to just shave off 1/8 of an inch. So look at the difference in the amount we're able to cut when we layer up the fabrics versus just doing it one piece at a time. But it's all a graduated journey, so don't run before you can walk. Practice on some scraps before you bring your good fabric to your cutting mat. And then once you've got some confidence, you can even start layering up your fabrics. I hope this helps you get a little more familiar with cutting with a rotary cutter, ruler, and mat, and leaving the scissors behind.